on this episode of the End of Tourism podcast.
Because our perception of what movement is and what is approved is based around, one, what we're taught, and two, what we see every day, but also three, what we can't notice unless we're forced to look at the same thing over and over again, right? Because our tendency is to see one thing, think, oh, I know it, I've spotted it, I know what it is, I've identified it, it fitted into my matrix of identity, I can move on now, it's all sorted. But the whole ethos, I guess, that I'm coming at is, what if you don't know? What if you don't know?
Welcome to the End of Tourism, conversations on wanderlust, exile, and radical hospitality. A quick reminder that the podcast lives on a gift economy model, which means that anyone, anywhere can listen, regardless of their economic situation. Your gift ensures it stays that way, free of advertisements and members-only paywalls. It allows me to devote a great deal of time to this project, to pay for the software and hardware that makes the podcast possible, as well as all of the production and post-production labor. In order to keep the project fed, you can subscribe by making monthly, annual, or one-time offerings at chrischristu.substack.com, where you'll also have access to my writing on these and other subjects including food culture, psychedelics, media ecology, and myth. You can also support us by leaving a review for the pod on Apple or Spotify, by sharing the episodes with your friends, and by following us on social media via the handle, The End of Tourism. On this episode, my guest is Craig Slee, a disabled writer, consultant, and theorist dealing with mythology, folklore, magic, and culture, exploring life through the lens of landscape, disability, and fugitive embodiments. He has contributed essays and poetry focusing on the numinous and disability to various anthologies, including the Dark Mountain Journal. Craig has also co-facilitated multiple seminar series at the Dresden Academy for Fine Arts regarding ableism in the arts, as well as how ableism affects our relationship to space. In 2023, he was one of the speakers at the World Future Studies Federation 50th Anniversary Conference, introducing the concept of disabling futures. He lives in the northwest of England, and you can find him online at cold-albion.net. That's cold-albion.net. Welcome to the End of Tourism, Craig.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be able to speak with you today. I've been ruminating for a couple of years now as to the themes that we might speak of, and was introduced to you via a mutual friend and have come closer to your work via the Emergence Network's online gathering, We Will Dance with Mountains, in the last quarter of 2023. And so to begin, I'd like to ask you first where you find yourself today and what the world looks like for you where you are.
Where I find myself today is by the canal in my flat, looking out the window, just as evening's coming in the northwest of England, in Lancaster. And it's chilly here, which is actually a good thing, I guess, these days.
Perhaps I could ask you to elaborate a little bit on what Lancaster looks like, but I know that, from our conversations previous that you grew up in Cornwall, a place that was previously a town, an area devoted to fishing and mining. And from what you've told me, it's also become a massive tourist trap. From the little that I've seen online, that the area receives around 5 million visitors a year, and tourism makes up about a quarter of the local economy. So I'm curious what you've seen change there, and what do you think has happened to Cornwall and its people as a result? And maybe there's something in there as well regarding Lancaster.
Yeah, so I should emphasize this. I was born in Cornwall. My family has lived down there for many, many generations anyway. And My father's side of the family actually, at various points, worked in the tourist trade as well before they went on to other things. And yeah, I mean, I left because, frankly, there was no jobs that weren't tourism. I came to Lancaster to study because, one, I have a physical disability, which means that Cornwall is a very rural area, so you need to drive everywhere. And that's fine. I drove at that point, but for good or ill, a more urban centre was better for me later in life as I left. But the way that it shifted, even in the years when I was growing up, was that, you know, it essentially was a rural area where nothing really happened socially or culturally that much until the summer seasons. So you were very, very aware of the seasons in terms of you'd have visitors starting, and that was when the town would wake up. And then it was kind of dead for the rest of the year. So it was very much one of those things where the tourist trade has actually made me more aware of human rhythms in the natural world than perhaps I would have been, because it's so based on seasonal stuff. And just looking at the way the infrastructure, because a lot of the towns and areas, they boomed a little bit, well, quite a lot in certain areas with the tin mining of the 19th century. But a lot of the architecture and things like that was 19th century. So you had small villages and slightly larger towns, and they have very, well, I guess some people, if they were tourists, would call quaint, narrow street. And when you have that many visitors in the summer, you can't get down the streets. You can't drive it because it's full of people walking. You know, there's an interesting anecdote I like to recount of when my father, who was a vicar, who was a priest, moved to a new area. He would go to the local pub, and all the locals would greet him as the priest and be like, very polite. And then when it would come out that my dad was actually a local, that he was born down there and part of a family, everybody would relax. And there was this real sort of strange thing where people came and stayed because it was a lovely area, but there was still that whole issue with second homes. And certainly keeping an eye on things from a distance here during the pandemic, when people left cities during the pandemic, they went down there amongst places in Britain. And that meant that literally there were no houses for newly starting teachers. You know, teachers who had got jobs and were moving down there couldn't find places to live.
Wow.
Because during the 2020 and sort of 2022 period, everything was just opening up either as Airbnb, because there was an influx from the cities to the more rural areas because it was supposedly safe, you know. And I feel like that's a reflex that is really interesting, because most people think of it as, oh, a tourist area, people go there for leisure. They go there to relax and get away from their lives, which is true. But under a stressful situation like a pandemic, people also flee to beautiful, quote, isolated areas. So there's that real sense of pressure, I think. And this idea that we weren't entirely sure growing up whether we would have a place to live, because a lot of the housing was taken up by people with second homes. And plenty of people I went to school with, because it's a surfing area, took the knowledge that they learned in the tourism trade and actually left and went to Australia. And they live on the Gold Coast now.
Wow.
So it's this self-perpetuating thing, you know?
Well, that leads me to my next question, which kind of centers around belonging and being rooted and learning to root, maybe even becoming a neighbor, or some might say a citizen of a place. And with tourism or a touristic worldview, we seem to be largely stunted in our ability to know a place, to become part of that place in any significant or enduring sense of the word. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on what it means to know a place, and perhaps on the often mad rush to say, I know a place for the sake of social capital, given the context of the kind of relative difficulties that one might incur or in a place like Cornwall, and the relative degree of exile that forces people out. What do you think it means to know a place in the context of all of these economic pressures denying us that possibility, or at least making it really, really difficult?
I think we have a real problem in modernity with the idea of knowing as a sense of capture, right? So if I know you, I have this boundary of this shape, this outline of Chris, right? That I can hold, that I can grasp. And I think sometimes when we say, oh, I know a place, or oh, I know a person, there's no concept of the ongoing relationality. You capture the image and then you keep it. And it's a whole construct of extractive knowledge that really, I think, comes down to the idea that the humans are the ones who get to decide what a place is, right? So I could say in the standards that, oh, I know Cornwall because I grew up there for nearly 20 years. My family has been there since about the 1500s. I know a place. It's in my bones. Yada, all the metaphors you want to use. But the fact of the matter is, the place itself influences me more than I influence it. So there's this strange sense of belonging in which modernity says, I belong, or it belongs to me, rather than perhaps the place has extended hospitality to me and allowed me to grow, and I could work in a place for 30 years and never know it because we're not comfortable as a culture with the idea of going, I don't know this place. And it's a variety. It's always changing. And I think about all the times I used to watch the sea and talk to folks whose parents were fishermen or lifeboatmen. And they'd be like, yeah, we know the waters, but the waters can change. We know roughly what they do under certain conditions, but we don't know them completely because they can always surprise us. And so when somebody says, oh, you're from Cornwall, you're a Cornishman, and all that sense of identity, I'm like, yeah, but that's both really fluid for me because, there's a lot of history. Is it the tourist world of the 20th and 21st century? Or is it the farming and the mining that goes back to the Neolithic? How we relate to a place purely in a modern sense isn't, to my mind anyway, the only way to conceive of belonging, because even though I'm now 300 miles away from there, I have isotopes, minerals from drinking the water in my teeth. So on some level, the idea that you have to be in a place also to belong to a place is something that I'm curious about, because there's this whole notion you're only in the place and you've been in a place for this long, and that means you know it and you're local. Whereas growing up, there was this sort of weird thing where it was like, yeah, you might have been here 30 years and everybody knows you, but you're not a local, right? You still belong. But there was this other category of you're not local or something like that. And so it's complicated, but I really do, for my personal take, tend to look at it as the landscape or wherever it is influences my sense of belonging in a non-human context or a more than human context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, I'm also in the context of identity, also wondering in what ways not only has the tourism industry shaped one's identity of being local, which is, I think, a huge issue in over-touristed places in the last, 10 or 20 years as identity politics rises into the mainstream. But then also not just the industry and the interaction with foreigners or guests or tourists, but the way in which the image of that place is crafted through often ministries of culture or heritage. So you could grow up in a place that isn't necessarily overly touristed or anything like that, but then have your identity crafted by these ideas of culture or heritage that the governments, federal and otherwise, have placed on people.
And especially because where I come from, Cornwall actually had its own language, which died out,
right.
which was on the verge of dying out in the 19th century. And slowly there are more speakers of it now. And you go back there now and you'll find, even when I was growing up, it wasn't so prevalent, but you'll find a lot of the signs for the street signs will have the English and the Cornish. So that where the government has embraced this identity and enhanced it after people have been saying, this is a language, we've rebuilt it, it's cousin to Welsh and Breton, we should use it as part of our identity. And it's got folded into that. And so the infrastructure itself has now been part of that. Those very same streets have a name that wasn't known for like 50, 60, maybe to 80 years. And suddenly people are now deliberately using the old names in non-English languages because of that. And it's very strange because, especially in the UK, what with all of Brexit and all that, there is a very weird sense wherein the rest of England, i.e. North and London and those sort of areas, don't understand because Cornwall was a peripheral area. And much like Wales, there's a lot of distrust of central government. So you've got this whole construction of a personal identity of nobody actually really understands what goes on outside. Either they're incomers, either they're emmets, which emmets is the Old English for ant, referring to tourists as ants in a kind of, they get everywhere. And the whole notion of who we are is always constructed. But in that case, going away and coming back to visit, I'm going, well, that street didn't have that label on it when I left, but it does now. And so in a certain sense, it's the same place, but it got this overlay of somewhere different that really enhances that sense of layers for me of which Cornwall, which of any of these places are we talking about? Like you say, is it the one you see on a picture postcard or on Instagram? Or is it the ones who are sat there as kids going, right, there's nothing to do, let's go and drink in a field, and all of these things can coexist.
Right. Yeah, I just interviewed a friend of mine, Christos Galanis, who did his PhD on hill walkers as well as homecomers in the Scottish Highlands. So people who spend their weekends climbing, summiting the Highland Mountains, and also the Canadian or Americans who travel to Scotland on heritage trips or ancestral journeys. And he mentioned how in the Highlands that the governments have placed the original Gaelic place names on all of the signs there, whether you're entering a village or perhaps on the street signs as well. And that he said that something like only 3% of the people in Scotland actually speak Gaelic. So they see the sign, they see the name, the vast majority of people, and they have no idea what it means. And I also remember the last time I was in Toronto, which is where I'm from originally, or where I grew up. And my family grew up in the east end of town, and the main thoroughfare in the east end of town is largely referred to as Greek Town. When I was a kid, it was certainly Greek Town. And now the Greek letters, the Greek alphabet, names, as well as the English names of the street signs in that area. But it's much, much, much less Greek than it was 25 years ago, right? So again, this question of like, is that to some extent trying to solidify the kind of cultural geography of a place, that people come to that street and that neighborhood because they want to experience Greekness in its diasporic kind of context. And yet so many of those people, so many of those families have moved on or moved along or become more Canadian in their own sense of the word. So
yeah, it's very strange as well because things like that attract, there's a loop, obviously, because you'll get people coming to experience the Greekness or the Cornishness. And people will be like, oh, we should open a business that will enhance the Greekness or the Cornishness of the place. And that'll draw, and it just becomes this thing. And yeah, it's very strange. And I would totally agree with you on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, until like a Greek person from Greece or a Cornish grandmother comes into town and says like, what? No, that's not.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I'd like to shift the conversation, Craig, a little bit towards ableism and begin with this question that comes from our dear mutual friend, Erin, and who admits that she's happily robbed it directly from Fiona Kumari Campbell.
Yes.
So you might have heard this question before, but she felt the need to kind of pose it anew. And so the question is this: how does disability productively color our lives? And Erin wanted to ask it, to modify it slightly and ask, how does disability generatively or creatively color our lives?
I can't speak to anybody's life other than my own, really. But I would say that for me, disability has, one, given me a real sort of ability to look at the world and go, you guys think this is how everything works, and it clearly doesn't. You know, it has given me a generative gift of going, hold on, what people think of the default really isn't the default, because I was never born as the default. And so I've had to find my own way of relating to the world. And that means that anytime anybody goes, oh, well, everybody knows, or the only way to do it is this, I am always sort of going, are you absolutely sure about that? You know, are you absolutely sure what you're looking at or experiencing or noticing is only perceivable in one way, is only ever frameable in one context? But also this idea for me that disability is simply a fact. It's not good or bad. It is a thing that exists in the world. And ableism is essentially the urge to measure against the vast field of disability and impairment and go, we don't want that. That's the worst thing to be. So we will strive to not be that. As Fiona Kumari Campbell would say, it sets up a ranking and notification and prioritization of sentient life. So this is why to a certain extent, we have such a obsession with youth culture. Young, healthy, fit folks are in some way better than the elderly. Oh God, nobody wants to get old because if you're of white extraction, oh, they'll probably stick you in a home. Nobody wants to conceive of the idea that actually you can have a generative and intimate relationship with somebody, not necessarily a romantic one, but a deep, deep friendship that also involves, frankly, to put it crudely, perhaps wiping somebody's ass, right? There's this whole notion of messiness and failure, and why Erin reworded it from productive to generative is that whole idea of being productive, of having capitalist use to produce, to make for purposes. And for me, disability and the field of disability in which I exist says I exist and I don't have to be productive. It really challenges the capitalist framework for me. And also ableism, because it's set up to rank things like speed, mobility, all kinds of things like that. Having a disability where you're sitting there going, but there are other ways to do this. There are other ways to exist, to notice the way our bodies move that are mostly ignored, in the sense of, we don't pay attention to our posture or our muscle structure or what our guts are doing, because we're all already forced along to the next thing. We're already touring from, okay, I've got up in the morning. Next thing I've got to do is have breakfast, right? And if you can easily shift between those stages, so you get up in the morning, start your breakfast, put your clothes on easily, you don't think about it as much. But if it takes you 10, 20 minutes to even get out of bed, and you have to do specific things, maybe exercises, maybe things like that, the whole process thickens. And in a sense, for me, it's an antithesis to escapism, because there are things you cannot escape. There are things you have to deal with. And because there are things you have to deal with, you have to pay attention to them more. And that means the most ordinary, mundane thing becomes, or can become, if you're willing to gently sense it, a lot richer. So this is one of those interesting things where if people want to go places to experience new things, okay, that's a whole issue that you've obviously talked about throughout the podcast. But there is a certain sense in which we don't even know where we started from. We've not explored our own bodies. I mean, I wrote a piece in 2020 when all the lockdowns hit that got shared around various bits of the internet. And I think even in the newspaper at one point but I got a request to syndicate it, of how to exist when you're stuck in your house. What do you do to keep, in inverted commas, sane, which of course is an ableist framework, but what do you do to stop yourself from losing mental health? How do you function? And I broke it down and I sort of made practical suggestions of, this is how I, as somebody that doesn't actually have a quotes normal life and spends a lot of his time unable to travel or go out much, stops myself from feeling isolated, because I've ended up having to learn to explore what some might regard as a limited domain. But to me, that limited area, that limited domain has given me this sense of vastness that, can't remember which philosopher it is, but there is a philosopher who basically says, I think is it Camus, who says you just need to be open when you're in your room and the whole world will reveal itself to you. And when you don't have a choice, when you're stuck in chronic pain or sickness or something like that, and you have to work out what to do with your limited energy to embrace life, there becomes a sort of challenge to go, okay, how can I feel like things are enriching? How can I almost metabolize the things that other people would reject? Because disability is so, it's so sad he's disabled, or we've got for this and that, and we've got to cure it. And it's not really about ameliorating suffering, which is a good thing. It's an unalloyed good to ameliorate any form of suffering. But there is this sense that the only way to perceive the world is through a so-called non-disabled, abled body. The only way to experience a rich world. And again, I'm not knocking people who do a lot of traveling per se, but the only way to experience the world is to go on long journeys and backpack and explore, new ways of thinking. That's great. And I'm not saying you can do exactly the same at home, but you can also become radically hospitable to yourself and to the environment in which you find yourself. And that opens a whole lot of doors that I think I would regard as generatively coloring life and revealing life in a way that was possibly occluded before.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what I've come to in the research around tourism and hypermobility is this question of limits. And that certainly comes up in other themes and other contexts, but not just the limits to one's place, like where does your place end, but also the limits of the human body. And when we talk about freedom generally in the West or in the context of modernity, it's so often pinned or underpinned via the freedom of movement, in part because I know you're coming from the other side of the Atlantic, but certainly in this part of the world, in the Americas, and especially North America, freedom is understood as freedom of movement because that's in part how the states and the nation's existences are justified. And so I would just ask you what you think of that in the context of freedom being, of course, a synonym for liberation, and how so many of our Western notions of freedom are attached to movement and have, to a large degree, become glorified in the hypermobility of our times.
I would agree with you. I think it was always there because of the colonial urge, but I think North American notions of freedom have, through a certain cultural hegemony, filtered back. You get it in the media, even Star Trek, the final frontier, things like that, or wide open spaces. There's still this notion of freedom to move, room to live. It has its own European context and horrors, unfortunately. But also, I think the notion of freedom as freedom to move, there is a question there for me, because I'm not sure we know what we're doing when we move, right? And one of the questions that always was raised for me is, if I raise my finger, as I'm doing now, and I bend it so it's 90 degrees, how did I do that? What did I do? Well, science would say, okay, you used all your tendons and so on and so forth. I'm like, yeah, okay, those are nice descriptors, but what did I actually do? Where's the connection between the impulse and the urge to bend my finger? Right? I don't know what I did there. I just thought, I want to bend my finger, and the finger bent. But there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. So when I'm thinking about freedom of movement, first, the question is freedom to move in what way? Right? So the classic example is in perhaps North America and English-speaking countries is to go where I want, when I want, with none to gainsay me, none to say you can't go there, which has been problematized thanks to the history of enclosure of land and capture by state and political actors. But also this notion that if you get into a city and you can go, and people go, oh, I'm free to go wherever I want. I always sit there and I'm going, yes, but you can go wherever you want. But if a place has stairs and no lift, right, I can't go there. So do I have less freedom? Well, according to the traditional notions of freedom, yes, I am less free. When I grew up, as an example, in the UK, I went to America when I was about 4 or 5, and I was absolutely stunned by the amount of public toilet that had a disabled toilet, right? Because virtually nowhere where I grew up at that point had a disabled toilet. This was due to the fact that the US has a disability rights movement that was slightly ahead of the UK's. So I was freer to go about my holiday in the US than I was technically at home, I couldn't go certain places because there weren't toilets or there weren't ramps because that had not been legalized. There'd been no legislation. In the UK, there was no disability legislation until 1995. So technically, I was born in 1981. I had no specific extra legal rights that I needed for 14 years.
Wow.
Now, some would say, that you've got freedom there. The law has given you freedom. It's given you the ability to move, but it's only given me the ability to move in approved ways, right? And so every single time somebody talks about room to move, my query is always, okay, one, as I said, move in what way? And two, who taught you what method of movement is approved or disproved? So particularly in Europe, we have folks like the Romani, the Irish travelers, even the so-called New Age travelers, right? Who are nomadic folks. And despite this obsession with freedom, the idea that people are nomadic, are shiftless and rootless still exists. Yes, the degree of privilege, the degree that I could be, quote, more confident going into public spaces. And you'll see this in American history and throughout European history as well. And when I was talking about the nomadic folks, I was saying, there are only certain people who are allowed to move in certain ways, to travel in certain ways that are approved. In similar ways with disability, there were only certain kinds of people who were allowed into public spaces. They might not have been legislated again in the mid-20th century. They might have struck those off the books. But at various points, at least in the US, if you look up the Chicago ugly laws, people who were regarded as vagrants or unsightly were not allowed in public spaces. They could be jailed for that.
Wow.
Not just loitering. It was very much anything that could give offense because they were physically disabled, or the idea that the physically disabled are more likely to be begging or doing things like that. That was all folded in. So this notion of freedom as the ability to move and move in space, despite the North American urge to be like, well, nobody can tell me what to do, there's still a certain level of certain forms of movement are privileged or regarded as normal versus others, right? So, it's weird if you don't stay in one place. Or perhaps it's weird if you don't have a reason for your seasonal job, right? When I was a kid and a teenager, like I said, where I grew up was kind of known for surfing, right? And I met folks who would come from places like Australia and live in Volkswagen transporter vans and work in the seasonal hotels and then go surfing. And then sometimes in the winter, they disappear off to Morocco and you wouldn't see them for 6 months.
Wow.
And they'd come back. And there's all this kind of idea of differing rhythms, which has really influenced my entire life because those folks, they were there. There were hundreds of them. You could see them parked on every road. And I knew several of them very, very well. But the fact of those seasonal rhythms, which weren't approved, it wasn't approved that they didn't stay in one place and pay taxes. To some, that might be, that's freedom. That's telling the government, I don't have to pay your taxes, or I don't have to stay in one place and be a registered visible citizen. I can be a free spirit and go to Morocco whenever I want. But the fact of it is, if you walked on the roads, people would look at you funny, right? If you look at people who do long distance walking in areas that are drivable, I mean, especially, I guess, in North America, I've looked at as very, very, very strange because you guys don't have the infrastructure So for me, it's this really strange notion that we're fixated on particular kinds of movements to do with agency and power, right? And we will say, oh, that's mobile, that's fast, that's quick, that's agile. And I'm always curious about what criteria we're using to say, oh, that's fast, that's agile, that's nimble. When you look at the so-called natural world and you've got plants that are seemingly immobile, but they actually turn to the sun. You just don't notice it until you stick it on a stop motion camera. And then you're like, wow, they move. But you could go past that plant every single day and be like, yeah, it doesn't move. It's a plant. It just stays there. Right? Because our perception of what movement is and what is approved is based around, one, what we're taught, and two, what we see every day, but also three, what we can't notice unless we're forced to look at the same thing over and over again, right? Because our tendency is to see one thing, think, oh, I know it, I've spotted it, I know what it is, I've identified it, fitted into my matrix of identity, I can move on now, it's all sorted. But the whole ethos, I guess, that I'm coming at is, what if you don't know? What if you don't know? What if that microphone that I'm speaking into and you're speaking into, it looks like a particular thing, and you think you could describe a microphone to somebody, but go down to, say, the flows of the electrons, and it's a context issue, you know? And so I'm interested in thinking about what are the contexts are in the room with us right now that we're not even paying any attention to, and not even in the room, in our own bodies, in our own language.
Wow. Yeah, again, there's so much there. My thoughts just flew off into a million different directions. And I feel like it would probably take me a while to gather them in.
No problem. You do what you need to do. I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah. So I had a queer crip travel writer named Bonnie Amour on the podcast in season 3. And we were talking about the fallout and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And she said something like, the settler can't stay still, that the pandemic showed us that we can't stay still. And in the context of that time, that so many people who had been engaged in and who glorify or who simply have been taught to live a hypermobile life, that there was this opportunity to question that, to bring it into a different context. And I know a lot of people couldn't necessarily leave their houses in the quote unquote lockdowns, but I don't think that wouldn't necessarily stop people from tending to or allowing themselves to witness the more than human world in that way. And so my question is, assuming we have the opportunity in some manner, in any manner, how do you think we might have our understandings of movement subverted or at least challenged by virtue of looking at the movement in the more than human world?
Great question. I think one of the biggest notions, and I just want to return to that phrase, the settler can't stay still, and really agree with that. And also add to secondary things of what actually is stillness, right? We have this idea of stillness as immobility, as perhaps staying in one place, not moving. But actually, if we look at what we're doing when we're actually apparently still, there's still movement going on, right? There's still movement going on in our bodies. There's still a different kind of mobility going. And we're not the only ones, right? The more than human does this exactly as well. If you look at a rock, you think a rock doesn't move? I mean, it doesn't move. But then you have erosion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the rain and the way that particles are shaved off it and it shifts. So when we're thinking about outside, when we're thinking about, and when I say more than human, I'm not saying better than human. I'm saying exceeding the human. I just want to make that clear. It exceeds the boundaries of the human. Disability, as mutual friend Bio would define it, is, I believe he said, it's a failure of power to contain itself. So that's bioakumalafe. And this notion that the world and the modern human flows through and beyond any sort of boundary, right? So any outline we form is not immune in the sense of there's no bulwark, right? A wall is not an untouchable upright edifice. It's actually touched and permeated, right? So everything in the modern human context interrelate and is, to a certain extent, degrees of permeable. So, yeah, our cells keep certain things out and let certain things in. But even the things they keep out, they're in contact with, they're relating to, right? Because in the same way with the COVID-19 vaccine, people think, oh, it's a vaccine, it's immunity, right? It'll stop me getting COVID, or it'll stop me getting this, or stop me getting that. What it actually does is it has an interaction with your, the vaccine has an interaction with your immune system. There's a dialogue, there's a discussion, a call and response, which then engenders further responses in your body, right? So there's constant relation that is ongoing. So nothing is one and done, right? To borrow from Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, no motion is ever completed, right? Nothing's ever finished. It's not like we're going to get off this and you'll be like, oh, I've finished recording the podcast. Sure, you've hit the stop recording button, but the recording of the podcast is still ongoing. And there's this fundamental ongoingness, which is a product of the world. The world is worlding, right? And that means the most ordinary, mundane thing you can think of is ongoing. The mug I have right in front of me right now with pee in, ceramic, it's been painted, but it's still ongoing, right? It still has the relation to the machines that shaped it. And it also has this ongoingness with the human history of pottery, right? And people go, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not practical. You know, it's a mug. But I always think, isn't that just commodification? Like, is that not just saying it's a commodity? It doesn't have a story. Like, I don't want to get on Marxist here, but there's that real alienation from ongoingness. And the fact that we also are ongoing attempt at relation. We're not even fixed identities. Our movement cannot be technically circumscribed because I have a disability, which means I can't dance, right? I use a wheelchair. I can't dance. I can't do the tango, right? Okay. But everybody uses dance in the context of bopping to the music and doing all this thing. And it's a bit like freedom. You know, everybody assumes that dance is a particular thing. But as Bio and We Will Dance with Mountains, the course, the whole point of it being called We Will Dance with Mountains is the fact that mountains don't dance like humans. Mountains dance like mountains. And the only way we spot how mountains dance is to actually pay attention to them and attempt to relate to them. We can't get out of our framework completely, but we can be open to say, what does our framework for a mountain miss about those massive landforms? What are we missing when we say a mountain doesn't move? And that's where you have references to indigenous and local stories that that actually talk about these landforms, these places, these folklore places, as the living, moving beings that they actually are. You know, yeah, okay, that stone circle over there was because a bunch of women were dancing on a Sunday, and in a Christian country, that's bad, so they got turned to stone. Or in Scandinavia, that rock there, it's actually a troll that got caught out in the sun. That these are living, ongoing beings and events, which it's not woo or intellectualizing. If you look at anything for long enough, you start to notice what's ongoing with it, even something that's solid and fixed. And that, to me, the gripping is the bending of the perception, right? That is queering, but crypt queering is that point where you have the restriction involved. People will talk about queer liberation, and yeah, we want crypt liberation. That's cool. But if you think about crypt liberation as it might actually be the limits bring us liberation. And then if you track back into mythologies long enough, you've got figures like Dionysus, or then poetic gods who say they're the ones that fetter you. They can bind you, but they can also set you free. And that is really interesting to me, that a lot of these liberational figures also have a side that they can tie you up. And I don't just mean in a bondage thing. It's this notion that the two things, the two complexes are part of a whole thing, and you can't divide it into restricted and free, and you can't escape. You can't pull a Harry Houdini from existence, which to a certain extent, some people, when they go on holiday, engage in tourism, they're trying to escape for a little while their other lives. But we all know you can't escape them. But the inescapability of it is not bad. Right? By default, it's not bad. It can be, but the assumption something is inescapable, just like, oh, something is disabling. The assumption of good and bad, if you can hold that in abeyance and actually look at it for a second and go, okay, what's going on here? Maybe our conceptions of this need reevaluating. Now, the reason we don't do this on the regular, even in modernity, it's because it takes a lot of effort and time to focus. And that's another benefit that I get as a disabled person, right? Because I can't use my time for a whole bunch of things that non-disabled folks can. So I've got more time. I've got a different relationship to time and space, which means that I can sit and look at things with that differing relation to time and space and be like, I never noticed that. And then I get to talk about this stuff to folks like you, and people get surprised. And they're like, you think about this all the day? I'm like, no, I don't think about this. This is my life. This is how I live. This is my embrace of life, right? And this is my freedom to literally be like, well, okay, my restrictions, how do they actually open me to the world? And I'm not offering a prescription here because everybody's different.
Right.
But it strikes me that even the most nomadic person always carries stuff with them, right? And to borrow from Ursula K. Le Guin with her carrier bag story of fiction, which Bio talked about in We Will Dance Mountains, the idea of what we're carrying is really interesting. But how often do we rummage in our own bag? Right? How often do we take up our backpack and rummage just for the sake of it? Often we just look in the backpacks for something specific, right? Oh, I need a map. Oh, I need a chocolate bar. Oh, I need my iPad, something like that. We rarely stick our hands in and notice the way our clothing might shift around our fingers, or the way, the waterproofing is possibly coming off, and it means that the fabric has these different textures because we don't take the time. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's the fact that we don't have that relationship to time and space. And kids do. It's why kids put things in their mouth, crying out loud. All those things where you're like, oh no, don't put that in your mouth. It's bad for you. That they don't know that. But the whole point of putting it in their mouth and feeling it is to try and not understand it, not get it. There's nothing there in a baby in its early function that says, I must understand what that is. The understanding comes upon you through experience. But there's no bit, at least as far as I can work out, that's like, I must understand what it is that I'm putting in my mouth. It's more like, that tastes interesting. It has some interesting textures. And then your brain does all the work. Or your brain and your body mind do all the work. But the personhood isn't also doing all the work. Just like the I of my body, right? My relationship with the I, as in my sense of self, I have to expand that to my entire body. Because there's so much going on right now in this conversation that I'm not aware of, right? There's stuff going on in my room that I'm not aware of, but it's going on now. And so I have to expand. And that expansiveness also means I sometimes have to venture into realms of pain, right? Because I have chronic pain. And in order to fully experience that, sometimes I have to encounter that pain. I have to slow down and focus and go, oh, the chronic pain that I was mostly ignoring because it's just in the background, it suddenly leaped to the fore because I'm paying attention. Now, modernity says you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do stuff that causes you pain. Understandable in a certain context. If I didn't understand that the pain was also part of the experience and changes how I move, if I didn't understand that chronic pain changes how time stretches, then I wouldn't be where I am. So the more than permeate the human in ways that the human is either deliberately trained to deny or doesn't even know is going on. And the pandemic basically was, in my eyes, the more than human kind of knocking on the door going, I'm not this completely hermetically sealed box, right? Your society is not a hermetically sealed box.
Amen. I mean, could have gone in a lot of different directions, but here we are, at least being able to reflect on it in a good way. And I'm reminded this notion of abeyance and attention and the expansion of the I. I'm reminded of this line from Simone Weil, who said that absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. And so I think that something like that is worthy of the times we wish to live in and perhaps sometimes do.
Definitely.
And so, I wish we had more time, Craig, really getting into some beautiful black holes there, but hopefully we get the opportunity to speak again sometime.
Be happy to. Be happy to.
And so before we depart, I just like to ask the kind of token question that always comes at the end of interviews, which is, where can our listeners find your work? And I'm pretty sure you had a book that came out last year entitled Goetic Atavisms, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I did. So you can find me on my mostly moribund, but strange little blog at cold-albion.net. And you can also pick up the book, which is, to be clear, more of an occult angle on this, but it also brings in the disability angle directly from the publisher Hadean Press, or you could get it from, the Bezos behemoth if you really wanted. I am also not really on social media as a project, but I'm also on, Blue Sky, so you can search me up there, or Mastodon, which you could always search me up there. And I occasionally post things on that.
Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure that all those links and connections are available for our listeners once the episode launches. And I very much look forward to reading Goetic Atavisms myself. So thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Pod. If what you heard had its way with you, if it left you with more questions than answers, then click subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or directly at chrischristou.substack.com. You can also follow us on social media via the handle The End of Tourism. I'd like to especially thank Alexei Galar for his assistance in the post-production process of this episode and many others in this season of the pod. You can check out his sound design and original music work at alexeigalar.com. If you'd like to support the pod in other ways, we'd love assistance in the form of post-production editing and promotion or anything else you feel called to offer. Until next time, farewell, friends.